Hello everybody. So I am making this video in reference to a few comments that I've got, and the comments go on say, what about nuclear? What about nuclear? What about nuclear energy? What about uranium? And so this is this video where I'm going to give you my thoughts about nuclear energy and the problems that I see with them as an investment and investing in them as an investment, be it through buying a utility stock or buying uranium stock or just thinking about it in the context of solar and other types of energy. So to me, when we think about the cost of energy, we must think about the levelized cost of energy. And when you start thinking about the levelized cost of energy, which is the sum of costs over the lifetime of the project divided by the energy produced over the lifetime of the project, we realize, mostly due to most of the cost overruns that nuclear suffers from, mostly from regulation, we realize that nuclear is actually a pretty expensive form of energy if you include the cost of construction of that nuclear plant. And I'm talking about the cost of construction of that nuclear plant in the modern era, right? I'm not talking about those that are already built. Like those that are already built, we should definitely keep running them. They're already built, they're working. But building new ones right now, with solar getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, I think is a losing proposition. So I look at LCOE. Solar and wind to a lesser extent, but I don't believe in wind and I don't believe in anything that has mechanical parts, like nuclear. Nuclear has mechanical parts, gas has mechanical parts. Solar panels don't have any mechanical parts. That's why they're cheaper. And solar panels are the cheapest form of energy. And my source here is Jonathan Gunnell, and feel free to go read his Medium article with his calculation. You can judge, but I find them very sound. But the question for me is if you're going to think about nuclear, you should compare it to the cheapest source of energy right now, which is solar. In my view, solar is the cheapest source of energy. And they're very similar energies, right? Solar versus nuclear, or fusion in the sky versus man-made fusion type reaction in a nuclear reactor. Right. And I do want to say that discussing nuclear often is sometimes a politically charged issue, but it doesn't have to be. I believe that nuclear was a stunning solution for the 20th century, but we're not in the 20th century anymore. We're in the 21st century, where we live in the century where solar panels are as cheap as plywood. That's the century we live in. And we also live in the century where, unfortunately for nuclear, there's plenty of new costs, new regulation, tremendous cost overruns that go with opening a new nuclear plant. And in addition to that, nuclear suffers from delays from environmental groups. And you're going to tell me every single project out there gets delayed by environmental groups. And that's true to an extent, but they go the extra mile to stop nuclear projects. Environmental groups might criticize a solar panel field for a little bit, but nuclear, they go the extra mile to make it unviable in the West. Any new nuclear project is just targeted with hundreds of lawsuits. And so nuclear probably still works wonderful in China, where you don't have such groups, where you don't have such regulation that lead to these overruns. And so nuclear is probably still great in China, because the LCOE of nuclear in China is not that high, because you don't have the cost overruns and because you don't have the delays due to the environmental groups. But in the US or in Europe, in my view, it's sort of dead on arrival. Building a new nuclear plant, you're going to have a wall of people who don't want it. Not to mention, these nuclear projects take longer to come to fruition compared to the politician in charge. The politician, if they change every 5 years, every 4 years, a new politician may just come in and prevent your project from happening, like that has happened so many times in Europe. So nuclear energy, to me, today has a lot of things going against it. And also, once we calculate the costs, I want to make this very clear. If someone is to calculate the LCOE, right, the levelized cost of energy of a solar system today, and you're using the cost of solars today, the cost of solar panel today, is you're likely overestimating things. You're likely thinking it's going to cost too much because you're not thinking exponentially. You're not looking at the declining cost curve. With nuclear, it's the opposite. Right? The cost curve works against nuclear because the costs of building a nuclear plant just keep going up, and up. And this is the latest nuclear plant that opened in the US, the first nuclear reactor to open in more than a 10-year period now. And you can see there were more than $20 billion of overruns in the Vogtle plant in Georgia from Georgia Power. You may have followed that. It's the most recent nuclear plant in the US, and the cost was 2.5 times what was initially planned, which is, if you calculate today the cost of a nuclear plant, you can bet by the time it's built, it's going to cost you 2.5 to 3 times more. While if you calculate today the cost of solar, you can bet by the time that you build it, it will be twice as cheap. It will be twice as cheap. Why will it be twice as cheap? Because if you look at the way solar works, this is the chart that I always show, but you can see that our predictions in solar have been consistently wrong. We've been consistently able to decrease the cost of solar by 10 to 15% each year, year after year, contrary to the estimates. You can see these are the estimates, all of these colored lines that you see. These are the estimates of what the experts predict, and the experts keep predicting that solar is not going to get cheaper, but solar just keeps getting cheaper. Like the price of a solar panel is a falling knife. It's literally a falling knife. Like don't buy solar panel and store them for 2 years because they're going to lose most of their value because they're becoming so cheap. In the meantime, not only do the solar panels become cheaper and cheaper, but they become more powerful. Right, as evidenced by efficiency increases. And efficiency in the lab of a solar panel right now is 47%. So for the same surface of a solar panel, within a 10-year period, we're likely going to double the efficiency in solar panels. And I don't see a reason why with new technology like perovskite, for example, I don't see a reason why we couldn't get to 50-ish, 60-ish% efficiency solar panel. That means solar panels for the same square footage would be 3 times more powerful, while in the meantime getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. You have a technology that uses silicon, that uses our learnings from silicon, and makes products that have declining cost curves, like consumer electronics. This is the same as flat screen TVs. Consumer electronics, better and cheaper year after year. This is not the case of a giant appliance like a nuclear plant. So nuclear plants were fitted for the 20th century. If we still have them, we should run them. We should not shut them down. But I don't think it's economical to build new plants unless you start thinking like a centralized power utility monopoly. And this is where things get very problematic, is you have a very important lobby of utility companies that are pushing for nuclear. Utility monopolies have an incentive to spend as much as they can on capital projects. Why? Because they get to recoup the cost of these capital projects plus a margin. When a utility company says, I'm going to invest $10 billion in a nuclear plant, they're going to recoup that $10 billion in the customer bills. And then they're going to recoup on top of that a margin, profit. And states typically regulate this margin or this profit at a 10% ROE. They typically look at the whole business and they don't want to see the utility earn more than a 10% return on equity. That's typically how they regulate it. But return on equity, you're playing with your earnings here. And so we know that companies have kind of control of how their earnings look like at the end of the day, at the bottom line of a business. So what happened in the latest nuclear plant, which is, I think, the pattern, at least in the US, of nuclear investments. So the Vogtle nuclear plant was supposed to cost $15 billion, and it ended up costing $35.7 billion. So that means that the utility company, instead of charging to the consumer $15 billion, they're going to get to charge to the consumer $35 billion. They have a built-in incentive for cost overruns. And this is a great article about Georgia Power from Associated Press talking about how they can already, customers are already paying, right? They can already start collecting paying $4.1 billion in advanced charges. So each ratepayer, so each person connected to the grid is paying $913 already. And then we're talking about also adding another 3.78 per month as soon as another reactor opens. This is all a big money business. And if you read the end of the article, Georgia Power could earn over an extra $9.4 billion in profit over the next 60 years due to the cost overruns that they did today. They get to charge a margin on top of those cost overruns. But here's the question, and this is why I would be very careful in investing in a utility that spends a lot of money investing in nuclear, right? The only utility that I consider investable is NextEra Energy in Florida, Florida Power and Light, who's all in on solar. I'd be very careful about a company like Southern Company or Georgia Power, which belongs to Southern, SO, ticker symbol SO. I'd be very, very careful about these companies, because when I think about these companies, all I think about is what's going to happen when customers get solar roofs, which they've already started, which utilities are already fighting. Utilities are already fighting against customers getting solar roof. What's going to happen? Well, here's what's going to happen. Bailouts, and more bailouts, because these companies are going to go bankrupt. That's what's going to happen. And the cost of nuclear energy is not the problem. The problem is the incentive system of the utilities. The utilities have an incentive to spend more money and ever more money because they get to charge more on top of the money that they spend on the capital investment projects. And by the way, this is not just nuclear. This is true for all capital investments made by utilities. All CapEx, they're going to make money on top of that. They're going to make a margin on top of that. And, the reason why solar and centralized power in general has trouble, in my view, is because we have these companies that are old school, 20th century, more grid-driven type of companies. That is the problem. And, I love business. I speak very highly of so many businesses on this channel. It's, it's my life. It's my passion. I love companies. Very rarely you'll see me call a company grid-driven, but that's the case, in my view, for most utilities. PG&E, I don't know if you've heard of PG&E, the fires in California. Now usually I would take any information about that with a grain of salt, and usually I often take the side of the business. Except in the case of PG&E, what happened is they didn't want to replace the hooks because, that's OPEX, that's maintenance. They didn't want to replace the hooks on the transmission line. One of these hooks, after 100 years, think about that, 100 years of rubbing. So you have the power line rubbing on the hook for 100 years, and after 100 years it breaks, it falls, and you have wildfire, and it kills 85 people. That's what I call grid. Like any company, I don't care how much of a capitalist the company is, I call this greed if you're gonna wait until it literally collapses before you change the product. This would be like building a house and using cardboard beams in your roof. That's just downright unethical and a bad business practice. But you can bet PG&E was all about CapEx. All about investing in natural gas, all about investing in these plants. We're going to make a bunch of money. But when it's about OPEX, nobody's there. When it's about that, hell no. And so I think that's one of the major problems of nuclear energy is that it is run by 20th century type of businesses that pay dividends, that have cash coming out of them, and that must maintain the profits and maintain the status quo. And so they have this incentive to overrun the cost of their projects. That's the problem number one, centralized power. Decentralized, I believe, is the way to go. And I've covered Enphase, I've covered Tesla so many times on the channel, and how, in my view, each residential home will have its own solar plant on the roof, and we'll have a mini grid. That's kind of my view. Here's the other problem. The other problem is power transmission, because, the U.S. has about 100 nuclear power plants. The U.S. has about 100 of them, and the U.S. is a huge country. So you're not going to be able to necessarily have the plant right next to the homes that use it. Oftentimes, the power has to travel hundreds of miles, and then we get into the problem of power transmission. If you have, let's say you have a 4 gigawatt, 4 reactors or 3.5 reactors power plant, you make 4 gigawatt in one spot, centralized. Well, you need to spread that out because you're making more power than the city can handle. So you need to spread that out and send it across your state. And when you send it across your state, you have to go through these transmission line. And we can see 69 trillion BTUs, the equivalent of all Americans using their dryers every year for their clothes, is being lost in efficiency losses, in transmission losses. This is this article from this author, Jordan Wirth-Brock. Feel free to look her up and see how she came up with this calculation. But she's showing you how much energy losses there is per state in electricity. And you can see for many states, it's above 5%. But keep in mind, that's just in state. Oftentimes, energy gets traded out of state. And so you have to ask yourself, how many transmission lines do we lose 15 to 30% in the energy just because we can't transport electricity very far without major losses? We can't transport it very far without major losses. And this is why, if you remember, summer of 2023, do you remember LK99, the superconductor that a Korean team was saying they had found, the room temperature superconductor? Well, that's why many researchers are after a superconductor, because if you had a superconductor, all of these losses would be essentially gone. You could produce electricity in the middle of nowhere and transport it to the other side of the country without having major losses. It would make electricity trading and electricity transmission all of a sudden feasible. Right now, the only way that we have to transmit energy with next to no losses is to use superconductors that are cryogenic superconductors. So these are superconductors that are cooled to minus 200 degrees Celsius with liquid nitrogen. And these are special cables that they use, and they circulate liquid nitrogen in those cables, and you have the triphase power going through, and there's liquid nitrogen going through, so it's extremely cold. And by keeping the cable cold, you're able to transmit power with very little losses, with minimal losses. But you can see the infrastructure required is not even funny. It is not economical. That's why LK99, everybody was so excited in August of 2023 when people thought, oh, we had found a room temperature superconductor which would allow us to transmit electricity without many losses. But again, that was not the case. That was not true. By the way, if you're ever interested in superconductors and how this works and those cooled cables, I find those fascinating. I believe that's how most electric charging will be done within like a 10-year period. Will we have 1.5 megawatt chargers, which will be cooled cables? Possibly, because you can transmit much more energy in a much easier, more efficient, smaller cable type of way. And so I believe those cooled cables, as long as we don't have a superconductor, they're kind of a way to go. Anyways, so that's the second problem: nuclear power transmission. When you transmit it out of state, you're going to lose a bunch of power, which defeats the purpose. And then the last point that I want to make is some of you, not as common as the nuclear, what about nuclear comment, but a little bit common is asking me about uranium, and specifically some of you have asked me about the triple EU, quadruple EU symbol, like Energy Fuels, which is a company that specializes in uranium, and talking to me about uranium stocks. Well, okay, so uranium is, of course, the commodity that goes into nuclear power, and the nuclear plants that I've already built need to buy uranium. But uranium is just that. It is a commodity, and the price of uranium has run up. And because of the price of uranium has run up, these companies that extract uranium, mine uranium, they've gone up too in prices. And if you look at the returns of uranium companies over the short run, I'm using all of these uranium companies that you see here come from this UTF, the Uranium Miners UTF. It's a good idea sometimes to get an idea of what companies are in the field. So all these companies compete each other to mine uranium out of the ground. The cost of uranium has gone through the roof. As a result of that, these companies have performed really well over the past 4 years. 43% average annual return over the past 4 years. That's absolutely excellent, right? More than double the NASDAQ. That's absolutely excellent. But here's the problem. And that's a general statement that I make about utilities. What happens when the cost of the commodity goes up, goes through the roof? Well, all of these companies start competing really hard against each other, and they start mining really hard. And the more they mine, the more they find uranium, the more they flood the market with uranium, and the cost of uranium goes back down. This is what has happened for oil and gas for the longest time. This is what happens with gold. Whenever gold goes up, gold prices goes up, gold miners go out, dig more gold, and sell gold. And I have no reason to believe that it's not going to happen for uranium. In my view, it's the same is going to happen for uranium. These companies are investing in their plants. They're all digging more uranium out. And then maybe 2, maybe 5 years from now, we'll have much more uranium. The price of spot uranium will go down on the market. And then these companies will go back to their history of quote-unquote subpar returns. Because even though the past 4 years has been a positive cycle for the cost of uranium, this ETF conveniently started in December of 2019, so I can't use this ETF, right? It's very convenient that this ETF started right at the perfect time. But if you look at on the longer time, so I took the leader in uranium mining, which seems to be Cameco Corp, which is one of the leaders in this ETF, and I look at Cameco Corp over a 14-year period. You can see over a 14-year period, the company has returned 3.6% over 14 years, while the QQQ, the NASDAQ, has returned, almost 18%, 17.6%. So one of them is a consistent outperformer. The other one, it depends what period of time you look at. And so, that is not to say that there can't be another doubling in the price of uranium stocks, but in my view, commodities, the more the price of commodities go up, the more it becomes attractive for new entrants to come in that market and dig uranium out of the ground and sell it on the open market. And as they do that, the price inevitably goes down, which is why if you look at commodities over the long run, the returns have been less than outstanding. So I try to steer away from commodities. This is nothing against nuclear, whether it's gold mining, whether it's oil and gas, or whether it's uranium, silver, copper. I try to just stay away from commodities because it's a different market altogether. So anyways, I hope I was able to highlight the problems that I view with investing in nuclear energy. This was not investment advice. This is just entertainment. I'm hoping you were entertained. I appreciate your likes. I appreciate your subscribes. Follow me on X if you can. Thank you for watching No Investment Advice. Have a great day.